The Great Hall of Concordia Prime stretched so far that the ceiling disappeared into artificial clouds. High above the delegates who filled its chambers with angry voices and desperate pleas for attention from the assembled masses of alien species, who had come from every corner of known space to participate in what would become the most important session in Galactic Council history, though none of them knew it. Yet Director Amara Chen stood at the human delegation platform with her hands clasped behind her back and her jaw set in a hard line that her aides had learned to recognize as barely controlled fury burning beneath the surface of diplomatic ice 4. 3 hours she had waited for the council to address the matter of New Jakarta 4. 3 hours she had watched alien delegates debate trade agreements and mining rights and cultural exchange programs, while her people's grief went unacknowledged. New Jakarta had been home to 12 million human colonists who had spent 40 years turning a barren rock into a garden world with cities that gleamed under twin suns and farms that fed not just themselves, but 6 neighboring systems that lacked the knowledge to grow food in difficult soil. The Valkyrie hegemony had wanted the planet for its deep core minerals and had asked humanity to leave, and when Director Chen had politely declined on behalf of the colonists who had earned their home through decades of backbreaking work, the Valkyrie had sent warships instead of negotiators. The attack had lasted for days. New Jakarta's defense fleet had been small because humans had trusted in council law that forbade such aggression and promised collective security for all member species who obeyed the rules that governed civilized space. The Valkyrie bombardment had turned cities into craters and farms into radioactive wastelands and 12 million human souls into ash that drifted through an atmosphere poisoned by orbital strikes. Chen had brought evidence to the council chambers and demanded immediate action under the collective defense protocols that humanity had helped write and had invoked 7 times in the past. 50 years to save other species from exactly this kind of naked aggression. The vote had not gone the way she expected. Actually, that was a lie, and Chen hated lying even to herself, so she admitted in the privacy of her thoughts that she had expected exactly this outcome because she had learned over 20 years of diplomatic service that the council only pretended to care about justice when justice aligned with convenience. Valkyrie provided quantum crystalline compounds that 17 major species needed for their industrial cores, and those 17 species had voted against intervention, and their client states had followed suit, and the mathematics of council politics had done the rest. The matter requires further study, the speaker had announced in his resonating voice that carried through translation matrices into 1,000 different languages simultaneously. We must not rush to judgment without considering all perspectives and gathering complete information about this regrettable incident. That word had nearly broken Chen's composure, but she had held steady because she represented humanity, and humans did not break no matter what pressures ground against them now. The session had moved on to other business, and Chen made a small gesture to her senior aide, who nodded once and activated the protocol they had prepared in the quiet hours before dawn, when Chen had realized that this day was coming, whether she wanted it or not. Point of personal privilege. Chen's voice cut through the chamber chatter like a blade through silk, and the translation matrices amplified her words to every delegate station in the hall. The speaker looked annoyed at the interruption, but council rules were clear about personal privilege, and he gestured for her to proceed. Chen walked to the central podium where speakers addressed the full assembly, and she pulled up a holographic display that showed a simple list rendered in neutral colors against the empty air. For 53 years, humanity has served on this council, she began, and her voice was steady and clear. In that time, we have contributed to the common good in ways both large and small. The hologram began to scroll through data. Humanity designed and maintains the quantum communication network that allows instant contact across the entire council space. Chen continued, we provided the medical database that increased average lifespan across member species by 37%. Human fleet elements have responded to 43 separate defense requests protecting member worlds from pirates, raiders, and hostile neighbors. Human engineers rebuilt the Karathi homeworld after the tectonic crisis and asked nothing in return. Human mediators have resolved 96 disputes between member species, preventing conflicts that would have cost millions of lives. Human agricultural experts have taught 82 species how to feed themselves on worlds. Previously thought uninhabitable, the list continued scrolling, and the chamber had gone quiet because even the most ungrateful delegates could not deny what the data showed in stark numerical terms. We did all of this, Chen said, because we believed in the principles this council claimed to uphold, and we believed that strength carried responsibility, and we believed that helping others was its own reward. She paused and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. New Jakarta has taught us that we were wrong. The speaker started to interrupt, but Chen raised her hand and her voice hardened into something that made even the largest predator species in the chamber take an instinctive step back. Humanity hereby withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately. She announced all human personnel will evacuate council facilities within 48 hours, and all human assets will be recalled to our own space. The chamber erupted into chaos, but Chen kept speaking and her voice cut through the noise. The quantum network will degrade without human maintenance codes that we will not provide, she said. The medical databases will lock in 30 days, and you lack the encryption knowledge to access them, and the universal translation. Matrix will fail when our linguists stop updating the core algorithms. Human ships will no longer respond to defense requests, and human engineers will not rebuild your cities, and human mediators will not solve your problems. Delegate stations lit up across the chamber as species tried to respond all at once, and the speaker was shouting for order, but nobody was listening because they were all realizing at the same moment that humanity had been the foundation upon which galactic civilization rested. Chun shut down her holographic display and looked out across the thousands of alien faces turned toward her in shock and anger and fear. You voted that New Jakarta was not worth defending, she said quietly, but the translation matrices carried her words to every ear in the chamber. So now you will learn what the galaxy looks like when humanity stops defending any of you. She turned and walked toward the exit, and her entire delegation fell in behind her. And not one of them looked back at the chaos consuming the council chambers as Chen's ship detached from Concordia Prime and turned toward the long journey home. She activated the final protocol and felt nothing as countdown timers appeared across 100,000 human-designed systems throughout council space. The galaxy had 48 hours before it started falling apart. Chun wondered how long it would take them to understand what they had lost. She suspected it would not be long enough. 3 months had passed since Director Chen's speech, and the galaxy was learning what absence truly meant when the absent party had built half of everything that mattered to modern civilization. Chief Engineer Vexthal of the Thalaxian Assembly stood in the central hub of the quantum communication nexus on Thalax Prime and watched error codes multiply across his monitors like some kind of technological plague, refused to stop spreading no matter what patches he applied or what redundant systems he activated. Quantum network had been operating perfectly for 40 years, and Vexthal had maintained it for the last 12 of those years, and he had always assumed that maintenance meant replacing burned-out components and updating software when the automated systems flagged outdated code. Now he understood that he had never actually maintained anything, and that humans had been doing the real work through access codes he had not known existed until they stopped working. Run the diagnostic again, he ordered his assistant, who looked exhausted from 3 months of double shifts trying to solve a problem. It seemed to grow worse every day. They failed to fix it. The diagnostic returned the same results. It had returned 500 times before, and Vexthal resisted the urge to smash his monitors, because destroying equipment would not solve anything, and because he was a professional who had spent his entire career believing he was good at his job. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out in 1,000 control centers and engineering bays and technical facilities where non-human experts discovered that their expertise had been shallow all along. Admiral Krenvik of the Corbinthy Defense Fleet sat in his command chair aboard the flagship Determination and stared at weapon systems that refused to fire because the authentication codes had changed, and nobody in his entire military hierarchy knew how to override human-designed security protocols. His fleet consisted of 300 warships that carried enough firepower to crack a planet if necessary, and every single weapon system had been built using human designs because human weapons technology was 50 years ahead of anything. The Corbinthy had developed independently. Contact human space again, Krenvik ordered. though he already knew what response he would receive, because he had given this same order 20 times in the past month. His communications officer shook his head and reported that all channels to human territory remained closed and that automated messages simply stated that humanity was not accepting diplomatic contact at this time and provided no timeline for when that might change. Krenovich had fought in 3 wars during his career and had earned his rank through battlefield excellence and strategic brilliance, but none of that mattered when his ships were effectively unarmed because the humans who could design his weapons had also designed the ability to turn them off from halfway across the galaxy. In the Council homeworld of Concordia Prime, a bureaucrat named Celtran worked through his 8th consecutive shift trying to manage the cascading failures, consuming the universal translation matrix that allowed thousands of species to communicate despite having completely incompatible language structures and sensory processing systems. Translation errors had started small, with occasional misinterpretations that created awkward moments during diplomatic exchanges but could be corrected through context and clarification. Now, the errors were catastrophic, with the matrix translating the Hendry word for peace as the Selkrit word for war and creating a diplomatic incident that had nearly triggered an actual military conflict between 2 species who had been allies for Generation. Celentran had sent urgent requests to the human linguists, who maintained the core algorithms, but those requests went unanswered because the linguists had returned to human space, along with every other human expert who had been scattered across Council facilities. The Council had thousands of linguists from hundreds of species, but none of them understood the underlying mathematical framework that humans had created to make cross-species communication possible, and without that understanding, they could not fix what was breaking trade routes that human patrol fleets had protected for decades fell to pirate raids that grew bolder. As the raiders realized nobody was coming to stop them anymore, merchant captains who had grown comfortable with safe passage now hired expensive mercenary escorts or avoided certain routes entirely, and trade volume dropped by 40% in the first 3 months after human withdrawal. Planets that had imported food from human agricultural experts faced starvation as crop yields dropped without the specialized knowledge that had made their farms productive, and local experts discovered they could not replicate what humans had taught them because they had never truly understood the underlying principles. Medical facilities across the galaxy lost access to treatment databases that contained cures for thousands of diseases because human researchers had encrypted the data, and the encryption was tied to authentication systems that no longer recognize non-human users as authorized. Council sent 5 separate delegations to human space, and all 5 returned with the same report, which was that they had been turned back at the border without being allowed to communicate with any human officials, and that automated defense systems had made it very clear that unauthorized entry would be met with immediate destruction. Some species blamed humanity for sabotage and claimed that humans had deliberately undermined galactic civilization as revenge for New Jakarta. Theirs blamed the Council for taking humanity for granted and pointed out that humans had warned repeatedly that they would not tolerate being treated as servants rather than equal. 17-member species formally withdrew from the Council in the first 2 months after humanity's departure, and another 33 reduced their participation to observer status while they evaluated their options. The Velkari hegemony watched the chaos with satisfaction and began launching raids on systems that had previously been under human protection, and discovered that nobody was willing or able to stop them from taking whatever they wanted. Council emergency sessions were called every week, but accomplished nothing because the fundamental problem was that the Council had relied on human competence for so long that it had forgotten how to function without. Its speaker Talvin addressed the reduced assembly during one such session and proposed sending a military fleet to human space to force negotiations and extract the access codes needed to restore failing systems. The proposal was voted down because nobody wanted to admit out loud that their combined military forces might not be able to overcome human defenses, and because starting a war with the only species capable of fixing their problems seemed counterproductive. Meanwhile, in human space, the Sol system and all human colony worlds had gone dark behind military technology that the Council had never known humans possess at long range. Scans showed nothing because human stealth systems rendered their space effectively invisible to Council. Sensors and any probe that tried to penetrate human territory was disabled and returned with a simple message that said, "Unauthorized surveillance." Would not be tolerated. Few desperate species tried to send civilian ships with messages of apology and requests for help, but those ships were turned back at the border with the same cold efficiency as military vessels. Humanity was not negotiating and was not explaining and was not responding to pleas or threats or bribes they had withdrawn. And they meant Titan, a small agricultural world called Nemshera, where human experts had taught the local population how to grow protein-rich crops in acidic soil. The harvest failed completely 3 months after the humans left, and 10 million people faced starvation before the next planting season. Council relief ships arrived with food but not with knowledge, and the Nemshara asked desperately when the humans would return to teach them what they had done wrong. Nobody could answer that question, because nobody knew if humans would ever return. The galaxy was fracturing along lines of who could survive without human help and who could not, and the second group was much larger than anyone had wanted to admit. 6 months after humanity closed its borders, the Galactic Council made its final, desperate attempt to force the species that had built their civilization back to the negotiating table, whether they wanted to come or not. "Tadmiral," Sektar commanded, the largest military fleet ever assembled in known history, with 10,000 warships, drawn from 40 different species who had contributed everything they could spare to this crucial mission. The fleet gathered at a staging point 3 light-years from the outer boundary of human territory, and Sektar addressed his commanders through the quantum network that was still barely functional, though it degraded a little more each day. "We are not here to make war," Sektar announced, though his flagship bristled with enough weapons to sterilize a dozen worlds. "We are here to demonstrate that the Council cannot be ignored and that humanity must negotiate whether they wish to or not." His commanders acknowledged the orders, though many of them looked uncertain, because fighting humans was not something any of them had contemplated during their careers, and because the intelligence reports on human military capabilities were troublingly vague. The fleet jumped to the edge of human space at a system called Threshold that marked the boundary between human territory and the neutral zone. A single human warship waited there. The vessel was massive and heavily armed, but it was still just one ship facing 10,000, and Sektar felt a moment of satisfaction that humans were not as prepared as he had feared. The human ship transmitted on open channels, and the voice that spoke was calm and completely unconcerned with the overwhelming force arrayed against it. "This is Admiral James Okonkwo of the human Terran naval ship Perseverance," the transmission said. "You are entering restricted space, and you need to turn around immediately." Sektar opened a return channel and tried to keep his voice reasonable and diplomatic. "Admiral Okonkwo, we are here on behalf of the Galactic Council to request negotiations regarding the restoration of critical systems that humanity has allowed to fail," Sektar said. "We do not wish conflict, but we cannot allow this situation to continue." There was a pause, and then Okonkwo's voice came back with a hard edge that had not been there before. "You cannot allow," Okonkwo repeated. "That phrase reveals the problem with your entire approach, and the reason you are here with warships instead of diplomats." "We will not turn back," Sektar declared. "We will proceed to the Sol system, and we will negotiate the terms of humanity's return to civilized society." "No," Okonkwo said simply. "You will not." The Perseverance did not fire weapons. Instead, something happened that made every sensor on every Council ship scream warnings simultaneously. Space itself twisted around 300 ships, and the forward elements of the Council fleet and gravity stopped following normal rules as ships were pulled toward each other by forces that should not exist outside of stellar core ships, collided at speeds that turned metal into vapor and crews into organic. Pace spread across ruptured hulls. 300 warships died in 17 seconds. Rest of the Council fleet tried to scatter, but their navigation systems, locked up as human code that had been buried in their computers for years, suddenly activated and took Control Sector S. Weapons officer reported that targeting systems were down and that the firing mechanisms would not respond to commands, and that backup systems were also compromised across. The entire fleet weapons refused to fire because humans had built those weapons and had built in the ability to turn them off. Whenever they chose, the Perseverance moved through the paralyzed Council fleet like a predator walking among prey and disabled ships. One by one, using weapons that Council scientists would spend years trying to understand, Sector watched his flagships systems fail and realized with sick certainty that humans had been holding back for 50 years and that the technology they had shared with the Council was primitive compared to what they had kept for themselves. Within an hour, 9,000 Council ships were dead in space with life support intact, but everything else. Offline only, Sectar's flagship remained functional, and Okonkwo opened a channel one final time. "You will return to the Council and deliver this message," Okonkwo said. "Humanity built the foundations of your civilization as a gift because we believed in cooperation between species, and we believed that our strength should serve the common good. We built fail-safes into everything we gave you because humans learned from history. And history teaches that trust must be balanced with caution. The Council failed the test of that trust when it abandoned New Jakarta, and now you fail it again by bringing weapons to demand what you have no right to take. We will not return to the Council, and we will not restore the systems you have allowed to fail, and we will not negotiate under threat of force. Some of you may yet earn humanity's friendship again," Okonkwo continued. "But it will be on our terms, and it will require that you prove yourselves worthy of the second chance you do not deserve." The transmission ended, and the Perseverance jumped away, leaving 9,000 disabled ships and one functional flagship to limp back to Council space. The journey back took 2 weeks, and during that time, Sectar had plenty of opportunity to contemplate how badly he had underestimated the species that had seemed so helpful and so harmless during their 5 decades of Council service. While the shattered Council fleet made its way home, other events unfolded across the galaxy. Human medical ships appeared at a plague-stricken world called Veltara, where the local government had requested Council aid 3 months earlier and received nothing but promises. The human ships ignored the local Council representatives and set up refugee camps, where they offered free treatment to anyone who wanted it, but only if they agreed to be evacuated to human space. 50,000 Veltarans accepted the offer and were transported to human colony worlds where they would be given new homes and new lives. The Council protested this violation of sovereignty, but the protests were ignored. Human cargo ships delivered food to 12 starving worlds that had declared independence from the Council, and the food came with no strings attached except a simple requirement that the recipient governments agree to trade treaties that bypassed Council regulations. Human engineers appeared on the Korathi homeworld, where tectonic stabilizers that humans had installed 40 years ago were beginning to fail. The engineers worked for 2 weeks and restored the stabilizers and refused payment, but left behind a message that said the Korathi people had always treated humans with respect, and that humanity did not forget its friends. The pattern became clear to anyone paying attention. Humanity selecting who deserved to be saved based on how those species had behaved during the crisis. Species that had voted against intervention, a New Jakarta, received nothing. Species that had abstained or voted for intervention received aid. Species that formally renounced their Council membership and asked for human friendship received full support. The Council tried to organize resistance to what they called human imperialism, but the resistance collapsed because too many species were desperate for help and did not care about Council politics anymore. On the agricultural world of Nemshera that had been facing starvation, human experts returned without being asked and taught the local farmers how to fix the mistakes that had killed their crops when Council officials tried to reassert authority. The Nemshara told them to leave and declared independence. The same dissimilar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. The Council was losing members faster than it could count them, and the species that remained were the ones too proud to ask for help or too invested in the old system to imagine anything different. Tadmiral Sectar delivered his report to the full Council assembly, and the silence that followed his description of the battle at Threshold was the sound of an empire realizing it had no power left. Speaker Talvin called for proposals, but nobody had any ideas worth discussing because the fundamental reality had changed and everyone knew it. Humanity was not coming back. The Council would have to learn to survive without them, or it would die. 1 year after humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, the political structure that had governed known space for 3,000 years existed only as a legal fiction maintained by the few dozen species too stubborn to admit they had lost Vril. Was a young Sesame scientist who worked in a human research facility on a colony world called New Hope that had been founded specifically to house refugees from failed council worlds. She had arrived 6 months earlier with 30,000 other Sesame who had fled their homeworld when the council government collapsed into civil war over whether to surrender sovereignty to humanity or try to maintain independence without the infrastructure to support it. The Sesame had chosen poorly, in Vril's opinion, and she had chosen differently by accepting the human offer of asylum in exchange for contributing her skills to the human scientific community. Now she stood in a laboratory that was better equipped than anything that had existed on her homeworld, and worked alongside human researchers who treated her as an equal rather than as an inferior species that needed constant guidance. The protein synthesis is still not matching the baseline, Vril reported to her supervisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who shared a last name with the director who had delivered humanity's withdrawal speech, though Vril had learned that Chen was an extremely common human surname. Try adjusting the temperature by 0.3 degrees, Dr. Chen suggested. Sesame biochemistry runs slightly cooler than human standard, and the baseline was calibrated for us. Vril made the adjustment and watched the synthesis rates climb to acceptable levels and felt a small surge of satisfaction at solving a problem through scientific method rather than guesswork. This was what she had imagined research would be like when she was young and studying at the Sesame Science Academy. But the reality of Council-era science had been very different, with resources constantly diverted to political projects and researchers pressured to produce results that supported whatever narrative the government wanted to promote. Human science was different, because humans seemed to actually care about finding truth rather than supporting convenient lies. Dr. Chen Vril asked during their break period, "Why do humans help species like mine when we contributed nothing to human civilization?" Dr. Chen considered the question while sipping coffee from a container that proclaimed her to be the galaxy's okayest scientists in cheerful human letters. "Because we can," Dr. Chen said, "and because someone needs to, and because we learned a long time ago that strength without purpose is just violence waiting to happen, but you withdrew from the Council." Vril pointed out, "You let systems fail and planets starve, and you only helped species that met your conditions." "We helped species that asked for help and proved they deserved it," Dr. Chen corrected. "There is a difference between abandonment and refusing to enable bad behavior. The Council treated humanity as servants." She continued, "They took what we built and gave nothing back, except demands for more. And when we needed them, they voted that our people were not worth defending. So, we taught them what the galaxy looks like when humans stop serving." Vril had no response to that, because everything Dr. Devine said was factually accurate, even if it made her uncomfortable to hear human strength described so bluntly. Meanwhile, in the remnants of Council space speaker, Talvin prepared for what he knew would be the final session of the Galactic Council. Only 43 species had sent representatives to Concordia Prime, and half of those were present only to vote for dissolution. Helvin had served as speaker for 20 years and had believed he was guiding galactic civilization toward an enlightened future where cooperation replaced conflict and where strength served the common good. Note, he understood that he had been guiding nothing and that humanity had been doing all the actual work while the Council took credit. The agenda for the final session contained only one item, which was a vote on whether to formally dissolve the Galactic Council and release member species to pursue individual relationships with humanity and each other. Talvin opened the session and delivered a short speech about the lessons learned and the mistakes made, but his hearts were not in the words, because everyone present knew the truth. Council had failed because it had become comfortable with having humans solve its problems and had forgotten how to solve problems itself. Vote was not even close, with 38 species voting for dissolution and only 5 voting to continue. Those 5 were the Velkari hegemony and its 4 remaining client states, who recognized that dissolution meant facing justice for New Jakarta without Council protection. The Galactic Council officially ended at 1400 hours standard time after existing for 3000 years. Stilvin signed the final documents and transmitted them to all member species, and then he resigned his position and booked passage on a transport to New Hope, where he had heard that humans were accepting council bureaucrats who wanted to learn how to govern honestly. The Valkyrie hegemony had spent the year after humanity's withdrawal expanding its territory. Through military conquest of worlds that no longer had human protection, they had seized 47 systems and enslaved 6 species and built an empire on the corpse of the council that had once constrained their ambitions. Then humanity responded, not with speeches or diplomacy, but with action that was swift and brutal, and completely overwhelming. Human fleets appeared in Valkyrie space and broadcast a simple message to the civilian population. The Valkyrie government committed war crimes against humanity and has continued committing atrocities against other species. The message said, "We are here to end that government and bring its leaders to justice. Civilians should shelter in place and will not be harmed." The Valkyrie military tried to fight, but discovered that their ships used human-designed weapons that stopped working the moment humans decided they should stop. The war lasted 6 hours. Valkyrie worlds were occupied by human peacekeeping forces who established martial law and began the process of identifying war criminals. The Valkyrie leaders, who had ordered the attack on New Jakarta, were arrested and transported to human space, where they would face trial under human law. The Valkyrie population was given a choice. They could accept integration into the new galactic order under human supervision, or they could be isolated on their homeworld with minimal technology until they learned to behave like civilized beings. Most chose integration. The species the Valkyrie had enslaved were freed and offered the same assistance that humanity provided to other species that asked for help on New Concordia, a space station that humans had constructed in neutral territory. 300 species sent representatives to what humans were calling the Assembly of Independent Worlds. It was not a council because councils made decisions for member species. The Assembly was a forum where species could negotiate bilateral treaties and could seek human mediation for disputes and could coordinate on matters of mutual interest, but each species remained sovereign and each species was responsible for its own choices. Director Amara Chen addressed the first gathering of the UHN Assembly, and her speech was broadcast across the galaxy. Humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council because we could not serve a system that valued politics over justice. Chen said, "We will not make that mistake again. The galaxy you are building now must be one where strength serves justice and where the powerful protect rather than exploit, and where partnership is earned through integrity. We will not lie to you and pretend this will be easy," she continued. "We will remain the strongest military power in known space, and we will enforce certain red lines that protect innocent life. But we will not rule you, and we will not solve all your problems. And we will not let you become dependent on us the way the Council became dependent. You will stand on your own feet, or you will fall," Chun concluded. "And we will help you learn to stand, but we will not carry you." The Assembly delegates absorbed this message with mixed reactions because some of them wanted human protection without human expectations, but most understood that this was the price of partnership with a species that had proven it would walk away from relationships that were not based on mutual respect. Rill watched the speech from her laboratory on New Hope and thought about how much the galaxy had changed in 1 year. Comfortable certainty of council rule had been replaced by the demanding reality of human expectations. Was harder now, but Vril suspected it was also more honest. Maybe that was worth the difficulty. 2 years after humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, the galaxy had been remade in ways that nobody could have predicted. When Director Chen delivered her speech in the Council chambers, the new Concordia station orbited a yellow star in neutral space and served as the hub for what humans called the Assembly of Independent Worlds, though most species simply called it the Assembly and understood that the name mattered less than the fundamental change it represented. 300 species had sent permanent representatives to the Assembly, and another 500 maintained observer status, while they decided whether to commit to the new order that humanity had created through absence and then through selective presence. Ambassador Keldon of the Thalaxian Assembly stood in the observation deck of New Concordia and watched ships arrive from every corner of known space. Thalax had been one of the first species to withdraw from the old council and to seek partnership with humanity, and that early commitment had been rewarded with trade agreements and technology transfers that had transformed the Thalaxian economy. Still thinking about the old days, a human voice said from behind Keldon, and he turned to see Director Chen approaching with 2 containers of coffee. She offered him one, and he accepted it because he had learned to appreciate human stimulants during the long tanned negotiation sessions that had built the assembly. I was thinking about how much has changed. Keldon admitted 2 years ago. My government was terrified that humanity would never forgive us for abstaining on the new Jakarta vote. Abstaining was not the same as voting against. Intervention, Chen said. Your government recognized that even if it lacked the courage to vote for justice, we feared the Valkyrie, Keldon said quietly. They provided resources we needed, and we thought we could not afford to antagonize them. Fear is understandable, Chen replied. Cowardice is choosing fear over principle, but you learned from that mistake. Keldon sipped his coffee and watched a Corvinthi transport dock with the station. The Corvinthi had also been early adopters of the New Order and had benefited from human military technology that actually worked now that humans were willing to provide the access codes. Director Chen Keldon asked what happens when humanity decides the galaxy has learned its lesson and withdraws again. Chen smiled, and the expression was not entirely comforting. We'll never withdraw the way we did before, she said, because the galaxy will never again make the mistake of taking us for granted. But we will not rule you either, she continued. The goal is for every species to become strong enough that they do not need humanity to survive, and if some species never reach that point, Keldon asked, then they will have human partners who help them grow until they do. Chen said, partnership is not the same as dependence. Crossed the station in a conference room set aside for judicial proceedings. The trial of former Valkyria hegemon Rathker entered its final day. Evidence against him was overwhelming because humans had spent decades monitoring Council space and had recordings of the orders he gave to attack New Jakarta. Rathkor had tried to argue that he was following accepted Council practice where strong species took what they wanted from weak ones and the weak accepted it because they had no choice. The human judges had not been impressed by that defense. The law is not what you can get away with, Chief Justice Martinez had said during closing arguments. The law is the standard to which we hold ourselves even when nobody is watching. You ordered the deaths of 12 million humans because you wanted minerals, she continued. You destroyed cities and poisoned an atmosphere and orphaned children because you believed. Might made right, this court finds you guilty of crimes against sapient life, Martinez declared in sentences. You to life imprisonment under conditions that will give you time to contemplate what you have done. Rathker was led away to a facility where he would spend the rest of his natural life, alongside the other Valkyrie officials who had planned and executed the New Jakarta attack. The Valkyrie population had largely accepted the verdict because even they recognized that their leaders had gone too far, and because human occupation had actually improved life for ordinary Valkyrie citizens who had been oppressed by their own government. Human administrators were strict but fair and did not tolerate corruption and actually delivered the services they promised. Was a novel experience for most Velcrit species that the Valkyrie had enslaved were rebuilding with human assistance, and several of them had already joined the assembly as independent members on the former council world of Concordia Prime, where the old council chambers sat empty and dark. A team of human archaeologists cataloged the historical records of 3,000 years of galactic governance. They worked carefully and methodically because humans valued history, even when that history was full of failures. It is important to remember what did not work, team leader Dr. Okonkwo said in an interview, so we do not repeat the same mistakes. The council failed because it concentrated power without responsibility, she explained. Species could vote to exploit others without facing consequences and could demand protection without offering anything in return. The assembly is designed differently, she continued. Each species is sovereign and responsible for its own choices and must negotiate individually for what it wants. It is messier and less efficient, Dr. Okonkwo admitted, but it is more honest, and that honesty is worth the inefficiency. Back on New Hope Colony, Vril had been promoted to senior researcher and was leading her own team investigating Sesame Human. Biochemical compatibility. The work was important, because more Sesame were emigrating to human space every month, and they needed medical treatments calibrated for their specific biology. Dr. Vril, one of her human team members, called out, "We have the results from the enzyme test." Vril reviewed the data and felt satisfaction at seeing the hypothesis confirmed. "Excellent work," she told her team. "This will allow us to synthesize medications that work for both our species." After the shift ended, Vril walked through the colony commons and observed humans in Sesame, in Corvinthy, in Thalaxians, and a dozen other species sharing space peacefully. It was not perfect, and there were tensions and misunderstandings, but people were trying to make it.
How to work, that was new under.
The council species had existed in separate bubbles, and it interacted only through formal diplomatic channels under. Human leadership species mixed and learned from each other and built relationships that were not mediated by bureaucrats. Vril thought about the question. She had asked Dr. Chen a year ago about why humans helped species that had contributed nothing. She understood the answer better. Now humans helped because they believed that was what strength was for. Not conquest and not domination, but protection. In building and teaching it was a strange philosophy to species raised under the council system, where strength meant taking what you wanted, but seemed to work. A human colony ship launched from New Hope carrying 10,000 colonists to a newly discovered world on the far edge of explored space. The colonists were 60% human and 40% other species who had applied for citizenship in the human Commonwealth and had been accepted after proving they shared human values. "It is important that we build together," the colony ship captain announced during the departure ceremony, "because the future belongs to those willing to work for it." The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel and disappeared from normal space somewhere in the depths of human territory and facilities that remained classified. The scientists and engineers who had designed the weapons and defenses that defeated the council fleet continued their work. They developed new technologies and new capabilities. "Because humans never stop preparing for the next threat, we hope we will never need these weapons," Chief Engineer Reeves told her team. "But we build them anyway, because hope is not a strategy piece, is maintained by those willing to fight for it," she continued, "and we will always be willing to fight on." New Concordia Director Chen prepared for another assembly session where 3 new species would formally join and 2 existing members would sign a mutual defense treaty. The work never ended, but Chen found she did not mind. This was what humanity had wanted all along, which was a galaxy where species cooperated because they chose to rather than because they had no choice. A galaxy where strength served justice rather than replacing. A galaxy where humans could be partners rather than servants. Shen thought about the speech she had delivered in the old council chambers 2 years ago when she announced humanity's withdrawal. She had been angry then and grief-stricken over new Jakarta and frustrated by decades of thankless service. Now she felt something different, not happiness exactly, because the galaxy was still dangerous and still full of species that had not learned the lessons humanity tried to teach, but purpose humanity had withdrawn from the Galactic Council and had taken its strength with its hand. In doing so, had shown the galaxy what strength was actually forth. Assembly session began, and Chen took her seat among the representatives of 300 sovereign species. The future was uncertain and difficult and full of challenges that would test whether this new order could survive. But it was on a stand that made all the difference.